Humanity is self-aggrandizing. We like to think that we are the pinnacle of existence. That even with our faults, you would struggle to do better than us. That we have control over our own paths and destinies. And most of all, we believe our individual lives have meaning in the grand scheme of life. But what if we were to pull back the thick curtain of reality and peer into its endless abyss, and in it spot a glimmer that tells us our ideas of importance and everything we ever thought to be true was not so? Hey, I'm Hound. Have you ever felt insignificant or small compared to the vastness of the ever-expanding universe, and that we, humanity as a whole, are just collectively hurling to our inevitable and fast-approaching deaths, and that nothing we ever do will matter in the next 1,000 or 500 or even potentially next 100 years? First off, sorry. Second off, boy do I have a genre of film for you. Lovecraftian horror is one of my favorite genres, as not only does it deal with heavy themes of existentialism and alienation, but it frequently incorporates experimental filmmaking. And it can be profound and thoughtful at times, while bringing with it some kick-ass horror. If you're like me and have aged alongside horror media, then you've probably experienced desensitization. This is a topic for another video that I plan on making eventually, so I'll keep it simple here. As a kid, a creature or a ghost would absolutely be scary. But as we grow older, those things become normalized, rationalized, and, well, less scary. Basically, we stop fearing the boogeyman in the closet and start fearing things like the concept of mortality, climate change, and the IRS. Meaning that over time, I at least found myself drifting more and more towards the cosmic. Fear of the unknown, existential dread, and specifically the atmosphere that comes along with it. Funnily enough, despite my predisposition towards enjoying films that delve into these topics, I've never done much digging into the genre myself, besides the surface level stuff, let alone into its origin. And that's exactly what I plan to do here. So, let's first go over what cosmic horror is and what it means exactly when something is Lovecraftian. So, it's Halloween, or at least it is when you're seeing this video. This is the part of the video where I have to regrettably inform you that this is a part 1 of now a 2-parter. The production of this video just kept spiraling and turning into my own little existential Lovecraftian nightmare. It took forever to get the pre-production phase done, the research, the writing, the double-checking of notes, the revision, the finalizing of a script, finding out that I had written 55,000 words, spending a week trying to cut that down and only getting to about 45,000, and just having to roll with it, because at that point I had already spent 4 months on the project. When really these videos mainly serve 2 purposes. 1, I like talking about movies, specifically horror, obviously. And 2, I really enjoy the post-production side of things. The editing, the grading, dialing it all in, and watching it all come together. Basically, I enjoy post a lot. Production, I can take it or leave it. Pre-production, however, if I could strangle a concept. In this part of the video, we'll be covering mostly Lovecraft himself and feature film adaptations of his work, with a small portion at the end for short films, therefore saving discussion on all non-adaptation films that include Lovecraftian concepts and cosmic horror for the second part, where we will cover the extent of Lovecraft's influence on mostly the horror genre. So yeah, if you're more interested in the next video that will go over more films like The Mist and Dark Sea, then absolutely feel free to wait for that. I really don't expect anyone to watch an over-hour-long video, let alone all the way through, so I will be providing a lot of chapters and timestamps in the description if you so wish to jump around to whatever may interest you. But yeah, let's get started. Where were we? Oh, what is cosmic? Cosmic horror is usually inextricably linked with the imagery of space tentacles, with innumerable mouths, teeth, and eyes. But that's a huge point of contention with the fanbase, as it kind of just dumbs down cosmic horror into being about floaty octopuses. And that's not where the actual horror of cosmic horror exists. Cosmic horror specifically is mostly comprised of 3 basic concepts. First and foremost is the fear of the unknown, something laying just beyond our understanding of the world that we couldn't possibly ever attempt to rationalize. maybe being uncovered by new scientific discoveries or by just happening to look in the wrong catacombs. Next is some good old existentialism at the utter inconsequentiality of life as we know it. Maybe that unknown has implications that we are nothing more than a meaningless ant on a giant space rock existing for a microsecond in relation to entities much older and much more powerful than us. Finally is madness, specifically when it's in relation to that unknowable thing. Maybe the mere sight of an indescribable horror shatters someone's ability to grasp what is reality, and they subsequently go insane. These three are pretty different and distinct, but they all work hand in hand to deliver true cosmic horror and dread. All in all, cosmic horror to me feels like we're the ant, looking up at something indescribable and alien to us that could, on a whim, eviscerate us and everything we care about, either willingly or accidentally, but entirely indifferent to our life. Lovecraftian horror, however, is a much more encompassing umbrella term that could mean a number of things. Of course, including all the mainstays in cosmic horror, but with Lovecraftian horrors, we also get shadow organization-y cults, genealogical revelations, a lot heavier of a mystery aspect, some your body is not your own type stuff, and of course, half fish, half human hybrids. This is a bit rushed and obviously could use a little bit more polishing, but to succinctly summarize, cosmic horrors are always Lovecraftian. But not all Lovecraftian horrors are cosmic, which is an important distinction to make because going into the video I thought that there would be a very visible line between cosmic and Lovecraftian, only to come to find that there practically isn't a line. So real quick, what isn't cosmic or Lovecraftian horror? Occasionally, cosmic-adjacent films get accidentally lumped into the category, sometimes because they're surrealist like the works of David Lynch, or engage in sci-fi body horror like anything from Cronenberg. Other times it's the misattribution of the nearby genre of folk horror, like Kill List and The Ritual, or it could even be the mere presence of creatures living underground, like in The Descent or Nightbreed, that get their hat thrown into the fray. Speaking of Nightbreed, Clive Barker's other film Hellraiser, and to be fair, a lot of his work, very frequently gets brought up as an example of Lovecraftian horror. But given Barker's understandable disdain for Lovecraft, and out of respect for Barker, I will be omitting him from the connection. Another film that is commonly mentioned is Evil Dead, but besides its use of the Necronomicon, it doesn't really employ any cosmic or Lovecraftian concepts or themes, doing entirely its own thing instead, and for the better. Similarly, Ghostbusters, featuring a pretty Lovecraftian antagonist, does not fall under cosmic or Lovecraftian horror, at least to me, it doesn't. So, now that we have an understanding of what cosmic and Lovecraftian horror is, and what isn't, let's dig a bit into where it came from. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a very influential writer, inspired by the likes of Edgar Allan Poe and Robert W. Chambers, that would, while writing within and helping flourish the weird science genre of fiction, create his own brand of horror, built upon a foundation of severe existentialism, increasing alienation, and fear of the unknown. At the time that Lovecraft was beginning his writing career, the typical fare for horror was blood and viscera and cloaked serial killers, whereas the horror lurking in the corridors of Lovecraft's mind were not so tangible. His deepest fears were of the cosmic variety. His stories weren't about human versus human, or even human versus animal. It was humanity versus the infinite and the unknowable. The overall insignificance of human life, bloodlines tracing back to reveal ancestral atrocities, and things that exist just outside of our understanding of reality, that have always been there and will continue to be there, even after we're gone. Lovecraft's horrors are multifaceted and heavily influenced by several of the key events that happened in his life. Very soon after his birth, Howard's father, stricken with syphilis and following a nasty psychotic break, was condemned to a mental institute where he would eventually pass. He and his mother then moved in with his grandfather in his very large home, where he was made acutely aware of his royal lineage, and had full access to his grandfather's library of books, where Howard would nurture many fascinations from science and astronomy to architecture and history, as well as multicultural influences. And it would be in this library with his grandfather where Lovecraft would discover gothic and weird fiction. Growing up, Howard would be afflicted with several illnesses that would hinder his school life, and when his grandfather died, they lost the home. He and his mother had to move into a cramped apartment, a stark contrast to the lavish mansion they were just living in. This would lead to a very toxic relationship with his mother, who grew more abusive towards him, only furthering Lovecraft's isolation from the outside world. She too would eventually be institutionalized and pass away in the asylum. Later in life, he would actually move to New York with his wife, where alongside his wife becoming sick and unwell, he would have multiple less than pleasant experiences with the local diverse crowd. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves for right now. Knowing all this about his life makes it clear where the inspiration for his specific type of horror comes from, specifically when it comes to tainted bloodlines, sudden insanity, and an obsession with genealogy, as Lovecraft most likely feared that he had inherited his parents' madness. However, despite these tragedies, he would eventually find his own crowd in a group of writers, later being urged to write more stories instead of his go-to of poetry, where he'd strike gold with Dagon, which would spark intrigue for its unique style and be the inspiration for more writings that would go on to be referred to as the Cthulhu mythos. Lovecraft's entire life was writing, from correspondence with his grandfather at the age of 3, to personal letters between colleagues and friends, to ghostwriting, to poetry, and penning his own published stories in magazines. It is specifically his bibliography of short horror stories covering both the Gothic and science fiction, all with their own uniqueness between them, as well as his Cthulhu mythos that he encouraged all of his friends to use freely to write their own stories and expand upon, that led to him being one of the most adapted horror writers on the screen. If we were to use IMDb as a metric, Lovecraft has about 280 films attributed to his name. While it's not quite as much as Stephen King, and only nearly half that of Edgar Allan Poe, goddamn, this is still a huge achievement for someone with only 20 years worth of stories to his name. Lovecraft would pass at the relatively young age of 46, after refusing not to go to the hospital over pain that would turn out to be intestinal cancer. He died in 1937. Which means he didn't even get to see the end of the Second World War. Real quick, can you imagine what kind of stories we could have gotten from a Lovecraft that witnessed a fucking nuke? We got robbed. He died penniless and struggling to survive, and might have been forgotten and lost to time if not for his dear and committed friends August Derleth and Donald Wandry, who worked to publish his life's work through Arkham House, a publishing house they created specifically for the works of Lovecraft, spreading his unique philosophy on horror even further. There is, however, a controversial aspect to H.P. Lovecraft, that being the absurd levels of racism, homophobia, and just in general the hateful thoughts and beliefs that he would harbor towards basically anyone who wasn't a straight white dude from New England, sometimes not even that. His xenophobia and racism would even find its way into his stories with depictions of non-affluent and non-white characters just straight up being blatant racism, sometimes feeling purposefully forced into the story just to be more racist. I will try not to spend too long on this, keyword being try. Was Lovecraft a product of his times? Probably. Could you argue that in his writings the aberrant shit on display is because it's from the character's point of view? Maybe. At the end of the day, Lovecraft was objectively a xenophobic, racist, homophobic, and absolutely just a hateful person that, due to my own experience of alienation to a similar degree, I can't help but feel sorry for him that that's the way he ended up. So afraid and hateful. Now, I'm not here to try to excuse or explain these things. Admittedly, it is a very interesting conversation to have, especially when you start examining his friend group and his personal life, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about movies. There's a good video by Chill Goblin that I'll link in the description that delves into this conversation much more deep than I could, and is a fun watch, if you're interested. Moving on. I feel that it's entirely up to individual people how they feel about it. If you feel that you can look past his toxic aspects and still enjoy his library of work for what it is and what it inspired, and similarly, if you can't look past those things and think that he should be pushed to the side in favor of authors and artists who weren't hate-mongers, all the more power to both sides. Personally, I'm somewhere in the middle, with a hefty side of we shouldn't idolize people in general. I just think the crucial mistake in discussing Lovecraft is when people choose to ignore this side of him, as ignoring it just makes the situation worse, especially when his views and beliefs are so ingrained into the stories that he wrote. Ultimately, it's up to the individual reader and how they interpret his stories. Take, for example, The Shadow over Innsmouth. One reading of the story is acknowledging its contents as a demonizing of miscegenation, or in other words, people with mixed heritage. However, another interpretation is one of acceptance of that heritage, abandoning the facade of what is deemed normal and living life happily as your true self with people who accept you for who you are. It's just, we know which one Lovecraft meant. Anyways, also the guy would surely have some nasty things to say about me, you know, me being an Irish descendant and all. And gay, but that's really only due to a technicality, which actually is a very fun conversation, as Lovecraft's work, so focused on alienated and isolated characters and a sense of being othered, would absolutely find a following in gay and queer readers, the more body horror aspects being akin to body and gender dysmorphia, as well as denial or internalized homophobia, while the ostracization feeling a lot of the characters deal with is a lot like the fear of coming out or being outed. So it's no wonder these stories would find a home with LGBT crowds. And I really hope we get more Lovecraftian films that tackle this subject, as it's a very important one that I feel can be explored very well through the lens of Lovecraftian horror. To be fair, Lovecraft died before Stonewall, the Civil Rights Movement, and even the Holocaust, which were all moments in history that preceded massive shifts in the general public's viewpoint on several big issues. Unlike J.K. Rowling, who actively donates to anti-trans organizations, or Mark Wahlberg, who beats the shit out of Vietnamese men for fun, Lovecraft's hatred never manifested in a physical form besides his written words, the bulk of which remained in personal letters that were only publicized after his death. And also, when science shifted away from touting phrenology, Lovecraft did as well. Hell, he even had a moment of self-reflection when he found one of his own letters and said to himself, "Damn, that guy's racist." I think he could have potentially came around. But who knows? Howard Phillips Lovecraft put a lot of weight on bloodlines and nature being the determining factor of someone's outcome. Ironically, in his case, not realizing how large of an impact that one's upbringing can play in not only their being, but their beliefs. Boy, I sure had a lot to say about that. Now that that's off my chest, let's discuss Lovecraft's writing. Specifically reading Lovecraft's writing. With these videos, I try my best to be thorough. That word's not real anymore. With these videos, I try my best to be thorough, sometimes watching 100 or more films in 2 to 3 weeks in order to just make sure I didn't miss anything. Here, I thought it would be absolutely clown-nose worthy of me to attempt to make a video on cosmic horror without having ever read a single thing written by Lovecraft. So I set out to change that. I spent 3 weeks with the help of audiobooks reading as much of Lovecraft's work as I could fit in the arbitrarily allotted time span. Here's a list of what I was able to complete, and I gotta admit, I actually really enjoyed it. If you plan on reading some Lovecraft yourself, I found that there were a few words that required a cursory Google search in order to fully understand, so allow me to quickly go over a few of them with you. Starting off with an easy one, eldritch, which is just a fancy way of saying weird. Then there's bas-relief, which is just one of these things. Non-Euclidean, which is math terminology, here used to denote the incomprehensible. Think of it the way that a 2D shape living in a 2D world would describe a 3D shape. Cyclopean, which is not the Greek guy, but actually a specific type of masonry. And finally, shoe, which is just Old English for show. One thing that books as a medium absolutely kicks film's ass on, funnily enough very pertinent to this video, is the ability for books to paint pictures, pushing the readers just enough in the right direction and letting their imaginations fill in the gaps. Getting to experience that again was one of my favorite things. I truly wish I were able to read more, but massive headaches and sudden onset narcolepsy issues keep me at a safe distance from any kind of books, except nonfiction for some reason. Then it's just my inability to pay attention and having to reread everything. It was also a really cool experience as well because while I'm pretty well versed in film language, I'm just an average person when it comes to books. So rather than having my analytical side trying to dissect the choice in lighting or what this piece of set decoration means, it was just nice to be along for the ride again with the story. Also, finally, I can be one of those pricks arguing about adaptations not being faithful enough to the source material. Sick, let's go do that now. As we begin to delve into the film adaptations of Lovecraft's work, there is one thing that will become glaringly evident, that being the translation of the written word onto the screen. Specifically when it comes to the depiction of people, places, or things, books inherently are rather subjective, and films, of course, are objective. When reading, you are using your imagination, with the help from the words chosen to envision what the writer wants you to see. If a line says, "He sat awkwardly in an antique chair," you could ask 10 people what that looks like, and they'd all give you different answers. When you commit that to film, it's only the one interpretation. In order for films to be more subjective, you have to branch off into experimental filmmaking that breaks away from traditional norms to start conveying things in a subjective manner in movies. Or just use narration that utilizes first-person perspective. The way a character describes something in a book lends insight into their mental state and their feelings towards it. Like, if they were to describe a chair as suspiciously placed with its back towards the door, in a film we would need voiceover narration bridging this gap, or some Edgar Wright stylized editing to get across to the audience that the chair's placement is of key importance for the building of tension or what have you. An example of this that leaps out at me is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where we follow Hunter S. Thompson on a multitudinal drug trip as he envisions himself surrounded by actual dinosaurs, and his lawyer turns into a werewolf way before he would actually turn into a werewolf. This solidifies one interpretation of the look, but it does get across what the character is actually seeing and doesn't adhere to objective reality. Yada yada. This problem is blown up when we consider the work being translated are the works of H.P. Lovecraft, a man who on the surface seemed to use the word indescribable as a crutch, finding several different ways to tell us that he can't tell us something, eventually turning in on itself and being kind of funny whilst reading multiple paragraphs of text describing the apparently indescribable. I personally really like it, and Lovecraft had to have enjoyed the notion himself. What this does is take something that exists within the world of the characters, and it slowly pushes the reader in the direction of understanding what it is, but never close enough that a small group of people would have the same mental image. I think this is one of the strongest positives of storytelling in book form, and Lovecraft masterfully stretched and molded it to fit the unknowable nature of his stories. But when you try to be objective about that, and you have to show what it is in a film, it kind of takes away that mystery, as well as solidifies only one interpretation of it. The best example for this is Lovecraft's short story, The Music of Erich Zahn, in which a poor man finds himself taking up residence in a derelict apartment house sort of thing, where above his room an elderly viola player spends his nights playing strange compositions out the front-facing window overlooking the rest of the town and the river. The narrator would describe the playing to the best of his abilities, painting a very loose picture that can be interpreted innumerable ways. The only guarantee is that it's a string, particularly a viola, haunting and shrieking, and that it was unlike anything he had heard before. So not at all contemporary for that instrument, or the time period. This is open-ended as hell. The reader could be hearing anything, ranging from ethereal drones to spastic staccato. A great example of Lovecraft's writing style and description of the indescribable being used to tailor the horror of the story to each reader in their own way. This story has been adapted several times in the short form, and every single time they get it completely wrong from what my ears heard while reading the story. Knowing a tiny bit more about music than the average layman, I envisioned atonal harmonies over frantic time signature switches, kind of sounding like some knocked loose played by someone with no sense of time or tempo, except on purpose. But apparently, all these short films just turned it into stereotypical classical music or avant-garde jazz.
I was haunted by the weirdness of his music.
Completely undermining one of the core building blocks of the Lovecraftian story. But it's not their fault. It was inevitable, through that translation, that one experience would be selected and objectively shown, and that objective experience wouldn't mirror that of my own. A lot of Lovecraft's work is like this, and the ones that do get adaptations are largely divisive. Thankfully, the Lovecraft fanbase isn't a pack of rabid wolves and generally approaches these adaptations more from the perspective of, cool, let's see what this thing is about, instead of caring about faithfulness to an unrealistic degree. It's more about getting across the Lovecraftian feel rather than being a literal one-to-one translation. So with all that said, let's finally get into discussion on some of the adaptations. I have noticed with this video that I tend to say a bunch that it wasn't a faithful adaptation as a criticism, but I want to hammer home here that I do not mean a one-to-one translation. I more so mean that it fails to capture the meaning or tone of the original works, arguably their strong suit, and just kind of muddies it all up and lessens its value. It just kind of irked me a bit And I do realize after editing and re-editing and yada yada that it was said a lot, but could be misconstrued a bit where it wasn't intended that way. Just wanted to clear that up real quick. Real quick, I should probably go over the selections here. I am mainly interested in the discussion of feature films. Short films, of course, are just as valid and as much art as feature films. However, the difficulty of sourcing and cataloging short films makes their incorporation into these types of videos, especially attempts to make definitive discussions on genre or whatnot, a massive headache. So we will be focusing primarily on the feature-length adaptations, and the non-feature-length inclusions herein will be those with a runtime approaching that of feature-length, as well as a couple episodes from Night Gallery. On that note, I also wasn't able to find all the films that I intended to watch, so I can't really speak on their quality or contents, and thus can't include them in this discussion. Apologies. I really hate leaving stones unturned. Now, finally, onto the adaptations, starting with Cool Air. The famous air conditioning scary story that after finally reading it, it isn't about that at all. As a fan of Goosebumps, I'm kind of disappointed. Cool Air follows a new tenant in an apartment complex that has a peculiar neighbor who keeps his room cool to an almost unbearable level of cold. After a chance encounter with said neighbor, our main character's curiosity is piqued, and he begins spending more time with him, learning all about his life and research, until one day, the air conditioning system keeping his room cool breaks. This is a good example of how a lot of Lovecraft's stories are predictable by today's standards, but the verbose way in which he writes and the way he guides us to those finales are super engaging and still very enjoyable. There's actually quite a few short versions of this story, but only a couple features. One being the 1999 version that I couldn't find, and the other being a reimagining of Cool Air as an early 2000s slasher flick of sorts. So let's talk about one of those shorts, huh? The Night Gallery episode, Cool Air. Rod Serling was a huge fan of weird tales, himself a prolific writer of science fiction horror, so it makes sense that he would have a few adaptations of Lovecraft under his belt. Cool Air here is a rather faithful adaptation of the story at hand, but it makes one very prominent change. Instead of a neighborly, strictly platonic friendship sparking up between the main characters and Mr. Freeze, this time it's a woman. The gender change of the main character, as well as the shift in the relationship's dynamic, is a perfect example of how to change things within Lovecraft's original works. Lovecraft himself would rarely devote time to such meaningless stuff. I can't recall a woman having a large factor in a story except for in The Thing on the Doorstep, and that's his own can of gender-bending, potential trans allegory, but most likely just misogynistic worms. So the change here done so in a way that enriches the interactions between characters and the gravity of the final act was magnifique. But we're here for movies, and we have one little pit stop before we get there, so let's move along. Real quick, Dreams in the Witch House has had quite a few adaptations, but none of them have really landed with me. The Twilight director's version for Cabinet of Curiosities was atrociously antithetical to Lovecraft. Stuart Gordon's own version for Masters of Horror was just begging for a bigger budget. The only feature film adaptation, Curse of the Crimson Altar, was kind of alright. I mean, it didn't have the fucking rat thing, so that's a massive plus, but also felt nothing like the other two, and more like a super loose rendition, which after I did a little research, yeah, it's not really a faithful adaptation at all. So that explains that. Nevertheless, Curse of the Crimson Altar, especially if you're a fan of Hammer horror aesthetic and stacked cast, including the likes of Alfred Pennyworth and Frankenstein, is the adaptation to choose. Though there is a huge asterisk beside the word adaptation here, as the TV adaptations of the story leave a lot to be desired. Now we can finally start our discussion on film adaptations of Lovecraft's work with Lurking Fear. Lurking Fear is a story about an unnamed narrator who goes on excursions looking for monsters and myths to seek out and explore. He goes to check out the Catskills after hearing about a lurking fear, a creeping death demon that would kill and also carry off victims towards a mansion atop the mountain under stormy clouds and loud thunder. His slim party is whittled down overnight, leaving just him alive, and despite this close call with death, he must know now what exactly the lurking fear is as he digs deeper into the history of the mansion. Laden with anti-native racism, which really for me is intolerable, making this story one of the more unforgivable in my eyes, constantly depicting natives as dumb and referring to them as squatters. Lovecraft talked a lot of shit for a guy with such a large chin. The creatures of this story are also just one big metaphor for inbreeding, and very well could have been meant to be a racist caricature. So that's great. Anywho, ignoring all the racism, admittedly hard to do. The story at play here is one of the aftermath of a rich family's extensive reclusiveness and aversion to anything coming from the outside world. Combine that talking point with a slow revelation of what sleeps beneath Martin's mansion, and it's a very interesting read. Again, while turning a blind eye to the racism. Lurking Fear has thus far received 3 feature film adaptations, so let's check those out, this time in order of their release. Dark Heritage in 1989. Despite some of the core changes made to the story, this still is the most faithful adaptation in feature form. Everything plays out relatively the same, except now it's a reporter investigating rumors of a cannibal family in good old Louisiana. And a new ending is added, which is the worst part of the film. Funny how that works, guys. And I'm a stickler for cinematography and can usually excuse a good bit, but this was tough. There's also a dream sequence that just comes out of nowhere with some next level cinematography and production that nestled between the whatever this is of the rest of the film, stood out and was a blast to see. Very reminiscent of Frostbiter, still lacking in multiple departments, mainly script and acting. If faithfulness of retelling is all that you're after and you don't mind lower budget features, then this is the one to go with. While rewatching for the selects, I kinda noticed I had to have been high as shit while watching this film. Yeah, sure, it may be more translationally faithful than the next 2 films we will discuss for Lurking Fear, but this is a tough film to sit through. But to me, there's better. Lurking Fear in 1994. This version follows a recently released man attempting to do some digging in a cemetery looking for treasure. It'd be more interesting if it were treasure, but it's just money. Money that his father left hidden from a crime syndicate that is now actively hunting the main character down. Meanwhile, a group of survivors in the rundown town band together in order to put a stop to the creatures that have been afflicting them for years, coming from underneath the same cemetery. The storylines begin to merge at the church when the groups are isolated and attacked by the creatures. Kirsty from Hellraiser and Jeffrey Combs from all the movies that Jeffrey Combs has been in, along with the dude from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, star in this full moon entertainment interpretation of Lurking Fear. Now, despite Puppet Master being one of my favorite guilty pleasures, I am probably the biggest Full Moon hater. Nearly every single film I've seen from them has waged an onslaught on my retinas that I cannot forgive. This film was actually pretty good. Absolutely boosted by the low expectations I had going in. I see this logo and I just start foaming at the mouth. This adaptation features the best creature design of the bunch, very reminiscent of Demon Knight in a way, as well as some fun comedy at times.
Jesus. Well.
The look of the film also is not evocative of the rest of the Full Moon catalog, so that's a big bonus. It's not a great film by any means, but it's my pick for best Lurking Fear adaptation, thanks to the creatures and obviously Jeffrey Combs. Our final Lurking Fear film, Bleeders, also known as Hemoglobin, and it's a bit of an odd one. In this interpretation, we follow a man afflicted by an unknown illness who, as a last-ditch effort, is returning to an island where his family used to live, looking for any answer he can possibly find. He soon discovers the island is beset by underground creatures that come out to feed on human blood. Starring Rutger Hauer with a screenplay co-written by Dan Lovecraft fan O'Bannon, this direct-to-DVD movie focuses way more on the hereditary aspect of Lovecraft's work, and specifically the curse in Lurking Fear. This is a welcome deviation in my opinion. The dire importance of a fatal disease of unknown origin, spearheading the main character's deep dive into his familial lineage for any kind of answers, feels right at home with a Lovecraftian story. This feels made for TV, but doesn't look that bad, all things considered. It just sucks about all the parts that suck. The creatures are disappointing, the attempts at horror are lackluster. I hate it when movies are this close to being good and just end up flopping on the ground.
Weak, pathetic fool.
Although I personally still found things to enjoy about this adaptation, I can't imagine ever recommending it to people over the Full Moon version. I can't believe I just said that. Now we move on to The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. In the short novel, we follow alongside a doctor who is looking into the history of his recently escaped patient, Charles Dexter Ward, as he unravels the events leading up to his admittance to the asylum. Over time, Charles had become more and more interested in his lineage, going back to a suspected occultist in his family named Joseph Kerwin. Eventually, evidence begins to suggest a resurrection of his murderous ancestor. This is one of the ones that I didn't get the chance to read. Yeah, the length of it put me off, my bad. It seems good though. Genealogical discoveries, Necronomicon, full-on Lovecraft fare with linking to other stories through events and name drops. I'll give it a read eventually. Maybe. But there's more pressing matters, such as the adaptations. The Haunted Palace from 1963. This is actually the earliest adaptation of a Lovecraft story, and it's named after a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, even including Poe's name at the front of the title, despite being entirely based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward by Lovecraft, who was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. A weird case for sure. That is a bit of misinformation, actually. There's a Spanish version of Charles Dexter Ward that was released 2 years prior in 1961, called Mark of the Dead Man. I also couldn't find a version of this one, so that's fun. After an intro depicting the townspeople revolting against Curwen's satanic ongoings at his palace, leading to the death of Curwen, but not until after he places a curse on the town, we fast forward about 100 years and see Charles Dexter Ward arrive at his newly inherited palace, displaying curious knowledge of a place he's never been to before and an even more curious likeness to the previous owner. The strong suit for this film is that it's peak Corman on Poe, with great gothic set design, lots of foggy streets and barrack alleys, and starring the delightful duo of Vincent Price, as charming as always, and Lon Chaney Jr. This adaptation focuses on the magical rituals, pitting Curwen as a sort of vengeful spirit getting revenge on the town that damned him, and including some interbreeding between elder gods and humans, possession, and of course my favorite topic being the impact the past has on the present. This film is highly recommended if you're into Corman stuff from this era. It forgoes full-on faithfulness, instead molding Lovecraft's work into one of my favorite formulas for 60s horror. The Resurrected, from 1991. This time we follow a private detective hired by the wife of Charles Dexter Ward, after his increasingly bizarre and worrying behavior as a result of digging into his ancestry. Ward has moved into a farmhouse, and bodies start turning up around town missing bones, as Ward exclaims that he is almost done with his research. Much more faithful to the source material as I know it, I don't. And directed by Dan O'Bannon, it feels like a mid-budget film that was heavily rushed, with lots of master shots with minimal coverage, noticeable ADR sessions, mostly minor issues like that. However, this adaptation has a gambit working in its favor, that being Fright Night, Child's Play, Chris Sarandon, energetic and visibly having a good time as his performance becomes more and more unhinged, taking Ham to new levels and devouring the scenery as the film goes on. The gore effects as well aren't bad. They're actually pretty cool, which is something typical of these Lovecraft adaptations. They usually put effort into portraying the grisly parts of his stories, which is my preferred approach to modernizing the horror aspects instead of adding a bunch of pointless action. Now, let's move on to another of Lovecraft's stories with Pickman's Model, told from the perspective of a man who recently shut down his art gallery, recounting to his friend the events of a fateful night after he decided to pay one of his artists a visit. Going deeper and deeper into his house, the paintings more and more horrifying. This was my favorite story by Lovecraft by a mile, which is funny because it's possibly his least cosmic, leading much more into the gothic side of his writings. I especially loved the theme of a town haunted by its past, the whole tainted soil aspect, which is what guides Pickman's selection of where he wants his studio to be. I love movies with themes like that, and we'll be covering it more towards the end of the video, or in the second part if I can't edit a 4-hour video in 3 weeks. Pickman's Model hasn't really had any feature-length adaptations. I tried my best to get my hands on a copy of Chilean Gothic, almost watched it without subtitles, and I only know enough Spanish to know when somebody calls me a slur and how to find a bathroom. So that's how down bad I was to see that movie. Given the brevity of the story, there's 2 short film versions that stick out the most. The Night Gallery episode, Pickman's Model, and the short film directed by Kathy Welch from 1981. There's also a Cabinet of Curiosities episode that, aside from the lovable dead fuck Jimmy, Crispin Glover, obligatory,
Where the hell's corkscrew?
was just not that good. I think this being my favorite of Lovecraft's stories made me a bit more harsh toward the liberties taken here. But all in all, the story parts dealing with Pickman were all fine. I liked what it did with the Pickman perspective, for example. It's just the direction that Thurber's character was taken that pushed me away. And with an ending that almost saved the film, it's definitely not the worst Cabinet of Curiosities episode. Looking at you, Witch House. In the Night Gallery episode, Pickman is working as a teacher when he gets fired, and an ex-student, hot for teacher, and more than captivated by his grisly paintings that could turn a man to stone, tracks his ass down using some stalker tactics. She pays him a visit, committing some technical trespassing, and Pickman finds her inside, trying to get her to leave before something finds them. Overall, shot well and with good acting, it is Night Gallery after all. The biggest issue I have with this adaptation, despite spoiling the painting in the opening, Rod, what the fuck, is the wacky creature aspect it decides to go with. Once we got to that part, it felt more like Scooby-Doo than anything. Besides that, it's a pretty alright watch. But this next one is much better, in my opinion. Pickman's Model from 1981. Directed by Kathy Welch. A writer is compiling a book on the local art scene which includes Pickman until he is kicked out for his grotesque paintings. Against everyone's advice, the writer goes to speak with Pickman in order to understand more of his works, to pick his brain, if you will. The rest plays out accordingly, but with a fun twist at the end. This is the only thing that I could find by Kathy Welch, which sucks, as it shows a ton of promise. And this version is the one that I would recommend, leagues above the others, as it's one of the more faithful adaptations, capturing the tone of the original story very well, including the slow descent through the house and Pickman's ancestry. I also really enjoy the deviations that it does make from the original story, a fascination with the perverse, without becoming perverse yourself. Now, let's go from horrifying paintings to body swap shenanigans with The Thing on the Doorstep. In the story, we open up with the narrator describing that he has killed his friend and intends to prove his innocence through the article that we are reading. Hell yeah, baby, epistolary. Going back in time, we're introduced to his friend Edward Derby, from the time that he and the narrator were kids to the time that they were in college, when Derby falls for a woman with a peculiar party trick. They're soon married, and Derby makes visits to our narrator, talking about how at times his wife seems different. I tend to like the less cosmic of Lovecraft's works. I don't know how that happened. The cultish stuff is set aside, spare for one part, and we're essentially just dealing with the topic of spousal abuse and a souring marriage, that feeling of being trapped. I think that there's a lot here that could be unpacked with the right adaptation. The Thing on the Doorstep, The Outsider, and Pickman's Model were my favorite of his stories that I read, and I really hope one day that they each can get their own thoughtful and appropriate adaptation. But enough daydreaming about future possibilities, and on to the adaptations that we do have. Strange Aeons, The Thing on the Doorstep from 2000, is an adaptation of The Thing on the Doorstep. It is relatively faithful besides changing Edward to a student of Upton's, a few minor tweaks here and there, and adding a very pointless, shitty action-filled finale. That was a bit harsh. I didn't like it, but did I have to write it like that? The fuck? The acting is so-and-so, but overall it feels very college-level production, and I can't really recommend it. What is it with people adapting Lovecraft and saying, you know what? This needs more action. Do people even read the stories? There's also an adaptation, again just called The Thing on the Doorstep, from 2014 that only 174 people have listed as watched on Letterboxd, with very scathing reviews. And I gave it a shot, but the visual eccentricity was just a bit too abrasive. I looked back at the average ratings, looked forward to the 120-odd films I had to watch ahead of me, and I decided I should move on. I did indeed watch it when I had a moment, because I can't just leave stones unturned, apparently. It does seem rather a faithful adaptation, however the aforementioned abrasive grading and technical choices are very overbearing and make it hard to watch at times. Actually most of the film. Combined with the spotty audio for a significant portion of the film, the technical shortcomings are greatly hindering the reception of whatever else the film was trying to accomplish. Thus, no matter how faithful a representation it may be, recommending it would be very difficult to do. But that leaves us with one feature-length adaptation, Suitable Flesh from 2023, opening up on the revelation that a psychiatrist has just brutally murdered a man, claiming that it wasn't him she murdered. Hey, my uncle tried that defense. It didn't work. We then go back to where the story begins, as she accepts a new and peculiar patient, bringing with him an excess amount of baggage, and as she becomes overly invested in him, it begins to take over her life as she knows it. Suitable Flesh is a lower than expected budget film that managed to make do with what they had and deliver a fun romp kind of movie that you'd put on for fans of the Stuart Gordon and Full Moon adaptations. Lots of unnecessary risers and editing decisions that ultimately left me desiring a more nuanced take on the story rather than a broad stroke generic horror film. Nonetheless, as it stands, this is currently the best adaptation of The Thing on the Doorstep. Something that I hope changes soon. But overall, wasn't too bad. You can just put it on. But that does it for Thing on the Doorstep. Now let's discuss the Dunwich Horror. On the outskirts of Arkham in the rural village of Dunwich lives the Whately family. Head of the household is who the village refers to as Old Wizard Whately, and his daughter who gives birth to Wilbur, a boy that begins to grow rapidly with no sign of stopping. Relatable. The rest of the villagers are suspicious of the Whateleys, the strange noises and smells coming from their attic, the nocturnal rituals being held atop the mountain, an excess purchasing of cows, and soon a destructive force terrorizing the village. Being one of the longer Lovecraft stories, this is actually a pretty interesting and well-paced read. I enjoyed the build-up of it, knowing that Wilbur is up to no good, but being in the dark about it for so long, making you go, what is this rascal up to? This story is focused much more on Lovecraft's brand of hatred for poor people than of people from a non-white background, as well as being a Lovecraft story with a more positive than most finale and a non-note or retelling-based writing perspective makes it stand out as unique among his library of work. So being less about giant ancient entities and only having a small portion of the book devoted to the indescribable, mostly set in a rural village with the only real weird thing for the longest time being an abnormal-looking Wilbur, you'd think that there would be quite a few adaptations of this story. Well, there's a 2008 version that has Jeffrey Combs that does not look good. Truth be told, I was like, okay, cool, who's this director? Transmorphers? Oh shit, this is the guy that did Beast of Bray Road. I saw that shit when I was like 10 on Sci-Fi. I was so disappointed. You realize how hard it is to disappoint a 10-year-old obsessed with werewolves with a werewolf film? Big Bad Wolf came out around the same time, and I dug the hell out of that.
You idiot!
Fucking Mexican Werewolf in Texas was even better. Sorry, back on track. I didn't check out the film. Yeah, I went back and watched this one too. Leave no stones unturned, yada yada. It was honestly better than The Thing on the Doorstep from 2014. Not a high bar, but whatever. Jeffrey Combs was very interesting, and dare I say the best part of the film. It's definitely an odd one, and as suspected, near impossible to recommend to anyone that isn't trying to be a masochistic completionist. I don't know what's wrong with me. So that means we just have one adaptation of the Dunwich Horror to discuss. The one from 1970. In the opening, we see Lavinia giving birth with Old Wizard Whately acting as midwife. We pick up on the story some years later with Wilbur Whately heading into Arkham, doing his research on the Necronomicon, as he comes across Professor Armitage, who has intimate knowledge on the Whately family history. After some drinks, Whately bums a ride from one of the professor's students, and as the story unfolds, we find out that he has much larger intentions for her, as the professor attempts to stop them. This is a relatively faithful adaptation of the Lovecraft story. A lot of the major plot points remain the same. Wilbur, twin, Necronomicon, locals banding together, rituals, you know, the usual, but with some minor deviances here and there. It also serves as the first real full Lovecraft adaptation in my mind, whereas others such as Die Monster Die or Crimson Altar were more in line with the Gothic Poe adaptations. This one is much more unique and finds its own style. One thing I personally loved was the depiction of the twin, the wind sweeping across the waters and the foliage, conveying movement of something impossible to visually grasp. It was just like I like my steak. Medium rare. I'm also an absolute sucker for films with this look, and this movie is very visually appealing. Gorgeous and intriguing set design, wonderful colors, and experimental play with the image and in-camera visual effects makes this a very fun watch. I forgot to add a segue for Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu. The Call of Cthulhu. In the story, we follow a man as, after the death of his great uncle, he inherits a bunch of newspaper clippings, research papers, and a neat little sculpture. He goes through them one by one, piecing together his great uncle's story told almost anthologically. The stories of a maddened artist who brought to him a sculpture conjured by his dreams, an inspector who witnessed the worship of a similar idol, and a man who was the sole survivor of a shipwrecked crew who discovered something not meant to be discovered. The Call of Cthulhu is a magnificent mixing of what makes Lovecraft's writing so enthralling. The detective aspects, cults, fishy dangers, piece by piece discovering bits and morsels of truth, the giant domineering presence of an ancient entity, and even more, such as archetypal characters that frequent his stories. It also gives us one of the more famous Lovecraft quotes. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents, which in itself is a thought-provoking and bittersweet notion, but it continues on to deliver a description of Lovecraft's idea of horror as well as his worldview at its core, written in a way that only Lovecraft could. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. As influential as this story is, and how this is easily the most known and cited source of Lovecraft, the namesake of the Cthulhu mythos, even the name of the tabletop RPG, it is baffling that, despite having multiple films called Cthulhu or name-dropping Cthulhu in the title, that apart from an Australian fan film that I couldn't get a hold of, that as it turns out isn't even an adaptation of Call of Cthulhu. Isn't this fun? And a softcore that wasn't actually that bad. No, really, it wasn't that bad. I just don't know if YouTube would like me talking about it. All we have is a short film that was produced by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. There's not much to say about this film narratively, as it doesn't really seem to change much from the source material, aiming to be as faithful of a representation as one could ask for, while putting on a display of very effective independent filmmaking and recreation of silent era films from the late 20s. Featuring wonderful use of stop motion to portray the impossible stature of Cthulhu and the Cyclopean island where he slumbers, this adaptation oozes the grassroots fun and creativity of a lot of early films, while being one of the most direct adaptations featured here. It was really well done. Now, quick aside, I will not be discussing Andrew Lehman's adaptation of The Whisperer in Darkness, because on top of changing characters into assholes and restructuring the main story in a way that deviates too far from the way information was collected and revealed in the original, which made it such a good read, this adaptation also felt the need to craft a complete third act from scratch, involving tons of pointless action, turning what is supposed to be a faithful adaptation into a piece of work that seemingly misses the point entirely. Again, apologies. So yeah, while there haven't been many adaptations of Call of Cthulhu, there are a couple of stories from Lovecraft that have gotten a ton of love in the world of film. The Color Out of Space. A man working as a surveyor for a new water reservoir encounters a barren field, referred to as a blasted heath. He questions a man living nearby who tells him what he wants to know. Several years ago, a strange meteorite, a color not like any other and made of unknown material, crashed into the hills of Arkham, leaving researchers perplexed as to what it could be. The next year, a family of farmers, the gardeners, checks out. At first, their yield seems bountiful, but the crops prove to be soured and rotten on the inside. This is the first sign of contamination that the family notices. The meteorite, now inside the soil and water, begins to affect the greater vegetation, plant life, wildlife, and soon, the gardeners themselves. This is another one of Lovecraft's stories that really works hard to paint beautiful images for the reader, especially towards the end. I think this is one of the more bare bones of Lovecraft's stories. It's not about a cult or a giant entity that brings about Earth's devastation. It's about how a small drop of the unknowable slowly spreads and contaminates the very foundation of life as it begins to take hold. And then, as suddenly as it arrived, it's again gone, back into the cosmos. It's a very moody story, and I obviously enjoyed it a lot. The bare-bones quality of it also leaves it up to numerous loose adaptations that use it instead as a starting-off point for their story. Meteorite crashes, devastation ensues. We'll be getting to some of those films that do this much later in the inspiration area, but for now let's discuss direct adaptations. Die Monster Die, directed by Daniel Haller, who would go on to direct a much better Lovecraft adaptation in the Dunwich Horror. Here the story takes way too many liberties and strays very far from the intention of Lovecraft's work as a whole. More science fiction-y morality play on excessive greed involving a space rock than an infection of an incomprehensible and uncaring alien life form on an undeserving family trying to get by. Still, despite its flaws, and thanks mostly due to the competency with camera work, the Hammer-esque aesthetic, and Boris Karloff, it is still an enjoyable watch. However, another adaptation I'm flat out not a fan of is The Curse. Similarly making odd and pointless changes, a ratty real estate agent storyline, and adding more character to the Gardner family, in doing so making each and every one of them insufferable.
Trees were moving, but there wasn't any wind.
Shut up, Wesley.
Like, yeah, that's exactly what I love about Lovecraft's work. The asshole dad, the cheating mom, and the bully stepbrother character, and oh yeah, wait, this is supposed to be a horror film. let's just throw in some zombies. Yeah, this is another adaptation that falls prey to the it needs more action notion that has the family turn into zombies that attack each other. I really don't like being negative. I could spew for easily an hour about my thoughts on specifically YouTube and social media and its effects on film criticism. But it's this constant struggle and tug-of-war between trying to minimize my own negativity, wanting to bolster positivity and just, in general, the enjoyment of film, but also doing my best to not sugarcoat anything in these discussions. If I have a grievance, I do my best to voice it, and that's why films that don't have a lot of positives don't get mentioned, unless I think that they're likely to frequently come up in the comments or just the discussion in general. That being said, I want to make it clear that I do understand this film does have merit. If I had been expecting something in the B-movie territory, maybe it would have been a better first impression. It's just, god damn, was it not an enjoyable watch for me when I was looking for cosmic horror. Sorry, but this was just not it for me. I'm going to cut the rant short here and move along to The Color Out of Space. The Color Out of Space, minus the U. It's different, at least. In an attempt to get away from the stress of the city, as well as reconnect with his family following his wife's cancer diagnosis, a man buys a bunch of alpacas. He also moves back into his childhood home, a farm on the outskirts of Arkham. A meteorite crashes on the property, of course followed by a meteor swarm, and a passerby hydrologist who examines it. Soon, creepy stuff happens in nowhere, mutations, strange growths, and the youngest member of the family gains an imaginary friend in the well as things continue to go downhill and fast. Although it is a bit too stretched out and too modernized in some areas, with some of the action pitfalls of similar adaptations, thanks to the fun cinematography, hammy Nick Cage making an appearance, competent body horror, and the focus on family bringing it all together, this film was still a very cool and enjoyable watch. And I'll tell you what, alpaca milk does a body good. I really did not spend enough time on this film. My bad. I want to quickly mention just how fucking gorgeous this film is. Anytime a film has color like this, it just fires all my synapses and makes me go, ooh, pretty colors. It's like wide shots of forests. It's just visually appealing to me, and this movie is filled with color and is just awesome in that regard. Issues here and there, of course, but it is a very visually loud film, which I always appreciate. As an aside, I love that the universal color used to depict the color is always a form of purple. Yeah, it could be related to the UV spectrum of light and how most of it is invisible to the human eyes, and the visible part of it just happens to be purple, but it also could just be because purple is the best color. But we're not done yet with The Color Out of Space. For some reason, lesser known is a German adaptation from 2010 called Die Farbe. I am most likely mispronouncing that, but that's fine. We all make mistakes. At least that's what my mom tells me. Die Farbe follows an American man searching for answers about his missing father as he goes to Germany, where he was stationed during the tail end of World War II. His search leads him to otherworldly revelations involving a small farmhouse deep in the forest. Die Farbe is a very quiet film, and a much more faithful adaptation while making minor, overall non-intrusive changes. I'm a sucker for the World War II setting, and a man searching for his father instead of an unrelated surveyor is a fine change, and quite possibly is better. The film also makes the no-brainer decision to shoot in black and white while depicting the color in, well, color, which feels like the only way visual adaptations of this story should be handled. The biggest issue with Die Farbe, because nothing is ever perfect, why can't we have nice things, is the editing. Odd choices here and there, as well as going back and forth between slow and thoughtful to quickly expositing dialogue in bursts. Another issue, to a much lesser extent, is the cinematography, but I'm only mentioning it because it's really only off-putting at the very beginning. As the film continues, it starts to smooth itself over. Or that's just me being easily wooed by wide shots of forests. Overall, this film is an easy recommend for fans of Lovecraft and fans of filmmaking in general. But of course, I do have to hammer home that it's a low-budget independent film, lest your expectations eclipse its capabilities. If accuracy to the source material was an issue with you for The Color Out of Space, then you have this film to cover for it, while being a very artistic rendition of a Lovecraft story with help from the location and setting making it stand out amongst the crowd. I enjoyed it a lot. But now we move on to the other most adapted piece of work by Lovecraft, The Shadow over Innsmouth. The story recounts what happened leading up to the bombing of the waters off the shore of Innsmouth, as our main character, intrigued by an ancient artifact and looking to find his own familial roots, is traveling to Arkham when he takes a momentary stop in the town of Innsmouth. Strange encounters with the stranger locals leads to the steady uncovering of the town's secrets, which turn out to have a lot more to do with the main character than he could have ever imagined, featuring extremely detailed description of every type of alley and building located within Innsmouth. Shadow over Innsmouth is a story by H.P. Lovecraft that focuses more on genealogical discoveries, also dealing with Lovecraft's thoughts on both of his parents having their own mental illnesses and how that may have affected him, as well as, of course, his distaste for mixed-race people. It also has one of the most unintentionally funny string of paragraphs as the main character stands in line at the ticket station as the ticket guy just unloads, unprompted, tomes of knowledge about Innsmouth. Again, unprompted. Dude has to be sponsored by Energizer because he just keeps going. Despite the heavy-handed description of architecture and specifically a singular room inside the hotel, this was a very solid read. The creeping dread and otherworldly presence, and specifically the history of the town and dealing with the deep ones, is very interesting. It was like reading historical documents detailing how a certain province began to flourish, except with a wonderful mix of mystic qualities. This is another story like The Color Out of Space with comets, The Thing on the Doorstep with body swapping, and Herbert West Reanimator with bringing people and things back to life, where the inclusion of fish humanoid creatures automatically lines up a ton of movies as being declared as Lovecraftian or Lovecraft-inspired all of a sudden, just for having the one-dimensional aspect. Creature from the Black Lagoon and Cold Skin, for example, where there really isn't a Lovecraftian influence, but it does have humanoid half-fish creatures. The story being open to interpretation like this highlights how different people can read and feel different themes and messages from its text. This leads us into the discussion of the different adaptations of it. So let's jump off the deep end in Innsmouth with Shadow over Innsmouth by Chiaki J. Konaka, where we follow a newspaper photographer and reporter as he goes to investigate strange rumors in Innsmouth, Japan. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. All the story really needs is some seaside, and last I checked, yeah, they got some of that. This made-for-TV adaptation is very noticeably that, but for some reason, I've grown accustomed to feature films in this style, so it didn't bother me at all. Its short runtime ensures that it doesn't overstay its welcome. The music was fun, and I enjoyed the cinematography a bunch, especially those wacky decisions. Any kind of fun dream logic in the visual representation of something, from Creepshow to Suspiria, is going to get a thumbs up from me. The story itself is very in line with the original, except here it includes a female love interest. Well, a couple, actually, sort of. But they're included in a fun way that ties into the story very well in my opinion. You take the travel to Innsmouth, odd locals, and genealogical revelations of the source material, and mix it up just enough to be a wholly unique and fun watch from a guy whose career shows his reverence and enjoyment of H.P. Lovecraft's writings. Anywho, there are still more shadows over Innsmouth for us to explore, this time returning back to the States, but not the shores of good old New England on the East Coast. We are instead visiting the Pacific Northwest. Cthulhu, from 2007. Traveling back to his seaside hometown for the funeral of his mother, a man who escaped his small and narrow-minded birthplace is once again face-to-face with his disapproving father. He traverses scrutiny of his life decisions, old flames that refuse to peter out, the societal pressure to adhere to heteronormativity, and the end of the world as he uncovers the town's secrets. 2007's Cthulhu, actually a rendition of Shadow over Innsmouth, is a lovely little hidden movie that I can understand why a lot of people are either indifferent or against it. Technically, it's a weird mix. It's independent and absolutely low budget, in the grand scheme of things, but it goes back and forth between rough around the edges, festival film fare, and being handled with care and competency, with jarring editing choices, occasional questionable composition, and despite me personally liking it, a harsh grade that might turn a lot of people off. On the other hand, it is also a well-acted, for the most part, and meaningful interpretation of a beloved literary piece. The first half of the film is riddled with anxiety, and the main character going back and forth between holding his tongue and standing up for himself, something very difficult to navigate in a family setting with a domineering parental figure. Then, as he peels back the secrets of the town, it takes a turn towards nightmarish, as he inevitably is forced to pit destiny chosen versus destiny predetermined. The thing I love the most about this film, besides the slow turn of the genre from drama to thriller, is the focus on a gay male lead. A common interpretation of Lovecraft's works, given his lack of female characters and focus on the bonding between two archetypal male characters is the underlying gay subtext, like in The Thing on the Doorstep. This film uses Lovecraft's work effortlessly to discuss the insurmountable alienation one can feel coming from a prestigious family and being different. H-Bomber Guy has a video using this film as a basis for exploring the attraction gay and especially young adults have toward the stories of Lovecraft, and how the focus on characters who are by and large outsiders speaks directly to marginalized groups. As far as Cthulhu goes, I think the film could have benefited from removing any kind of mention of cosmic horrors in the title or previews for the film, as sitting down for a somber, gay family drama about a man returning home to a place where he was ostracized, turning into an apocalyptic psychological horror, would be an excellent mid-movie twist for someone who went in blind. However, that is a lot easier said than done, and I do not envy the marketing department for this film. So, yeah, that about does it for adaptations of Lovecraft's work. Why does it feel like I'm forgetting something? The undying love Stuart Gordon had for Lovecraft's work is well cemented in his devotion to adapting multiple of his stories, especially the less explored ones, and way before it was the cool thing to do. He also gave us a killer doll movie that puts Full Moon to shame, and for that he's a saint. So let's take a trip backwards through time and discuss each of them, leading up to, in my opinion, his magnum opus. Dagon, despite the name, is his adaptation of Shadow over Innsmouth. We discussed this in the aquatic horror video, so I'll keep it short here, and the same goes for aquatic horror mentions in the inspirations section. A man plagued by prophetic dreams of a mermaid-like woman finds himself stranded in a fishing village after a boating accident. As his friends start to disappear, he is taken aside by the town drunk, and he finds out that the town has special plans in store for him. Much like Gordon's adaptation of Dreams in the Witch House, you can feel this project begging for a larger budget to truly bring it to life, mainly in terms of acting, visual effects, sound, and at times cinematography. Meanwhile, the location and set design are very atmospheric and are doing their damnedest to hold the film up, with a welcome dose of gnarly practical effects to assist. It makes quite a few changes to the story, another of the adaptations that fall for the gotta have action trap, meaning the film loses a lot of the poignancy and impact of Lovecraft's endings in favor of a bombastic climax. If you're a devotee of Gordon's work or similar low to mid-budget horror, I guess campy would be the word, then this is right up that alley and in line with his other adaptations, and is an easy recommend in that regard. But there are more movies to discuss, so let's move along with Castle Freak. Castle Freak is a rather loose adaptation of one of my more favored Lovecraft short stories, The Outsider. The Outsider is about someone who has lived for years and years in an inescapable castle that acts as their prison, with nothing but literature to keep them company. Unable to grasp the memories of a time spent not inside there, they decide one day to climb. The story crescendos as they emerge from the heights of the castle and find themselves clawing up onto a field of grass. It's hard for me to read this story as anything other than autobiographical. Lovecraft was an immensely reclusive, isolated, and alienated person, growing up with only his grandfather's vast library and his rocky relationship with his verbally abusive mother. He must have, at times of venturing out into the world, thought himself to be a monster, never to fit in or be welcome for being different. No doubt the isolation being a catalyst for his less savory and xenophobic views, in turn working to make him even more isolated, in turn again making him more afraid of the outside. The things that I happen to share in common with Lovecraft make some of these stories very hard to read, and this was one of them. Severe isolation from an early age going through adulthood, alienation, physical deformities, the worry of certain negative genetic traits passed on to me. It's just, those things didn't make me misanthropic to the point of excessive racism, they just made me a hefty bit of an agoraphobe. I've seen quite a few adaptations of The Outsider, usually in short form, but I don't think any of them quite really nail the loneliness and the sadness that is at the core of the story. And I think in general, a lot of the adaptations of Lovecraft's other works, such as The Thing on the Doorstep and The Shadow over Innsmouth, similarly disregard the emotional weight of them in favor of action climaxes and playing up the horror by contemporary means. And I think that's why I harp on they felt the need to include action a lot. That there's so much more to the stories that these adaptations are just failing to pick up on. It just does a huge disservice to the sadness that can be found in Lovecraft's work. So back to Castle Freak. A family still attempting to heal after a tragic accident inherit a castle and travel to it to get things in order for putting it on the market. What they don't know is that they didn't just inherit a castle, but also a severely tormented and abused creature that roams the halls at night. The father must step up in order to do what's best for his family, but it turns out that he and the threat might have more in common than he thought. Why do I have a bad taste in my mouth? Oh. Charles Band, owner of multiple castles, basically used the old American International Studios technique of we have a poster and we have a title. Whatever you do that can tie the poster and the title together, you can do it. Just have it done next month. And at the thought of doing another Lovecraft adaptation with that one simple caveat, and of course one of Band's many castles, absolutely Gordon took the offer. Castle Freak is largely known as being an adaptation of The Outsider, but truth be told, it's more of a mashup involving plot points from the case of Charles Dexter Ward as well as the Dunwich Horror. It also feels very gothic inspired with a bit of Stephen King, but that's just where my simpleton brain goes whenever I see a castle and a core plot point happens to involve an alcoholic father trying to regain the good graces of his family. It's a full moon production, therefore it deserves the boot. But I do agree that's being a bit harsh. It does feel made for TV, but the location, a forgotten castle with lots of open area, kind of saves it by being interesting in and of itself. It's also very nice to see Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton in a film together, as their chemistry has always been great. The film itself is an odd one. It has some sexual assaulty stuff that, I don't know, it's just a weird inclusion that is very off-putting. A lot of things in this film happen to bring up the question, why? Such as the family drama aspects, the prostitute, and the freaky deaky freak. But the story does end up going to interesting places by the end. It's all the pit stops we make before then that hold the film back, in my opinion. I guess if I were in the habit of making clickbait video essays, I would make a video called Why Castle Freak is Everything Wrong with Lovecraft Adaptations. But thankfully I have standards. And also this movie is nowhere near the worst adaptation, but most people haven't seen those, so. However, as it stands, if we instead of comparing it to the literary work that it is based on, and compare it to the rest of the full moon, that's too easy. Let's just say charm-driven, sleazy flicks that you'd be likely to see at the late-night drive-in double feature with a film like, I don't know, Critters or The Boogans. This movie fits right in and does a good job of doing it. Stuart Gordon's Castle Freak actually got a remake called Castle Freak, but this time from 2020, that took the initial mashup and said yes, but more, turning itself into a more front-facing adaptation of several of the Cthulhu mythos stories. I went in wanting to hate it, and don't get me wrong, I did. But I also enjoyed a lot of what it was doing. It was a fun kind of cheesy that saves some real fun for the third act. I like the change away from the blind daughter, here a blind female protagonist with a female freak counterpart. I guess we're still at the point in time where any kind of disabled representation is welcome. So that's cool. I also liked that it leans fully into the Necronomicon and the Dunwich Horror aspects, creating a sympathetic creature with a body count of annoying slasher extras that got lost on their way to set. It doesn't have the same legs to stand on that the original did, but I think it served its purpose in being a modern, schlocky fun film. At least it was better than those Miskatonic University movies. Sorry, Michael Paré. From one seldom adapted Lovecraft story to another, we will now look at Gordon's take on the short story From Beyond. In this Lovecraft story, we follow a friend of the scientist Crawford Crawfish Tillinghast, who has supposedly reached an interesting point in his research. Crawdad leads him up to a room housing a giant machine. Sitting him down and turning it on, he reveals that the machine causes our pineal glands to open up, allowing us to see into another plane of existence where strange creatures live all around us. Crawford F-150 also explains that the machine is a two-way street, allowing the unknown creatures to see humans, and that some of them aren't friendly. Despite its hammering on the importance of the pineal gland, comically dating this, and oddly making this one of the few stories I read of Lovecraft's that tries to be tangible with its science, in turn shooting itself in the foot because of that, it's still a very cool story. When it comes to the more sci-fi stuff out of Lovecraft, this is what I dig the most. Dealing with the concept of invisible frequencies of light, and even in some inspired takes on the cosmic and Lovecraftian horror, the inaudible frequencies of sound is a very interesting topic, ripe for the indescribable horror that exists all around us without our knowing. So let's see what Gordon did with sights laying just outside the human eye's wavelength, with his film From Beyond. After a scientist is suspected of the murder of his colleague, who was researching stimulating the pineal gland with a special machine in order to see beyond the normal wavelengths capable of the human eye, and even reality, a doctor in charge of the alleged murderer collects a crew of people who return to the scene of the crime in order to attempt to finish the research. From Beyond again stars regulars Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, this time accompanied by the always lovable Ken Foree, in one of the go-to films of the sleazy, slimy body horror greatness of the 80s. From Beyond is a great example in feature form of what I meant by the necessity of experimental filmmaking to really convey Lovecraft's indescribable horrors on screen. Not only is this film packed wall-to-wall with some of the sickest viscera and body horror effects, but it also features that prime 80s blue screen jank effects, which are absolutely perfect for creating that not of this world, uncanny feel so common in Lovecraft's stories. Adapted here through an almost comedic lens, seemingly in on the joke, the horror, however, is always played straight. I love the set deck of the house and just the way that the machine looks, and, of course, all the pretty colors. I absolutely have gripes with the story. The pineal gland thing, the way it feels written just because this needs to happen, the excessive perviness, and the pacing feeling disjointed at times. But really, who the fuck cares? It's a fun film filled with fun, eye-catching effects and light shows, an amazing cast with one of the most over-the-top antagonists in a horror film, all topped off with the unique interpretation of Lovecraft brought to us by Gordon and Paoli. If you're into sleazy 80s goodness with kick-ass visuals and score, because who the fuck isn't, this is an insanely easy recommend. As we depart from Beyond, we travel back to where it all began for Gordon's Lovecraft affair. What I think is the pinnacle of Gordon's adaptations. His take on Herbert West, Reanimator. But first, let's take a look at the story itself. We are told the story from an unnamed narrator that runs into Herbert West, an eccentric student at Miskatonic University. West believes that he is on the brink of perfecting a serum that will completely reverse death, and, given that the narrator is the only person not entirely dismissing him as a lunatic, West enlists the narrator to aid him as they go through several bouts of experiments to increasingly disastrous but fruitful results. Throughout the story, several dominoes are lined up left and right, with the climax involving them all cascading down around West, in this tale of obsession and consequences. Themes of meddling with life and being haunted by both your failures and successes and attaining further knowledge of life and existence, written in a serialized format with forced cliffhangers and every entry starting with a detailed recap, making it very difficult to read the full story in succession. This story is Lovecraft's take on zombies, essentially his go at a Frankenstein character, fully bearing his gothic influences before he would go on to discover where his stories would truly flourish. One of my favorite parts of the story is how each installment introduces things that are then slyly pushed away, and it all comes back in the final moments of the story in the form of comeuppance for West. It was a very fun read in that regard. This is also another example of Lovecraft stories where there aren't any women, and the two leads are very, very close male friends. They were just roommates, guys. Two dudes being dudes and inseminating other dudes with serum. Furthermore, Herbert West Reanimator features some of the more blatant, flat-out racism from Lovecraft, specifically and regrettably in my favorite section, 6 Shots by Midnight, word to Dr. Loomis.
I shot him 6 times.
Where a good portion of Lovecraft's other works have the racism kind of curtailed by pushing it on to something other than humans, or using such descriptors as "What the fuck do you mean by this?" This installment of the story is heavily bogged down by the almost gleeful depiction of a recently deceased African-American boxer as a loathsome gorilla-like thing, serving as a strong reminder of Lovecraft's despicable views and willingness to write them into his stories, even when it serves zero purpose other than to mock a marginalized group. Anyways, Reanimator. The dude basically invents a stronger, more universal Narcan that, in theory, would reverse all effects of both clinical and biological death, if only administered closely thereafter. That being the core of the story and what drives it forward, the need for fresher bodies. So let's take a look at how Gordon adapts that story for the screen. After an incident at the University of Zurich, a medical student seeking to further his research into a death-reversing reagent relocates to Miskatonic University, where he meets fellow student Dan Kane and Dan's girlfriend Megan. Once word gets out about West's unorthodox beliefs and experiments, everyone disapproves and shuns his ideas. West decides that he must win them over with success, and along with Kane's help, they begin stealing human bodies from the morgue. This is where it all started. The dynamic quadruple of Stuart Gordon directing, Dennis Paoli writing, and the acting talents and burgeoning chemistry of Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, who would all go on to work together on numerous projects throughout their careers. In adapting, Gordon and Paoli worked together to reformat a lot of the story beats so that they're more tightly connected, moving West into the same hospital as the narrator, now Kane, who is also renting a room to West. The bodies also now coming from the hospital. It's basically much more fitting for a feature film for it to be restructured this way, and they did a really good job. Here, again, the addition of a love interest is done well, and brings with it higher stakes and a wonderful conclusion to the film, as well as the inclusion of a rival head doctor at the university who wants to claim the serum as his own, who becomes the central antagonist for the story without taking too much of the spotlight away from West himself. The changes made to the story are handled carefully and are all in service of the core themes of obsession and both a man's failures and successes in egotistical pursuits coming back to haunt him. Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West legitimately knocks it out of the park. Easily one of the strongest acting performances in horror history, and the staying power that he has in the discussion speaks for itself. In some scenes, he is perfectly embodying the manic psychotic qualities of a mad scientist. In others, he is one of the most dapper-looking individuals, stone-faced and determined, while walking around with such an air of cockery that you legitimately believe that he could and would eat anyone he's in the room with. Gordon and Paoli also picked up on the dark comedy of the source material, dialing it up to 11 for their film with tons of gore and gallows humor that fits seamlessly within the story. A wonderful mix of splatter, humor, and science fiction horror filled with wonderful lighting and effects that cement this film as one of the best campy horror film comedies, period. Reanimator would eventually get 2 sequels, each of them many years apart, when producer Brian Yuzna took up the director's cap. Don't get me wrong, I liked Society a lot,
I am a butthead.
but these just did not do it for me. I mean, Bride is alright if I'm being honest, especially if you really liked David Gale as the reanimated antagonist and couldn't get enough of Jeffrey Combs, both very understandable positions, but Beyond Reanimator went way too far in my opinion. They both, however, felt like they lost the plot, instead just attempting to milk the cult status of the first film, and left me sorely missing the love and care that Gordon had for the source material. And yeah, that just about does it. We've covered almost all the feature-length adaptations of Lovecraft's work, mainly the ones that I'm willing to showcase. But there are still a few films to discuss, those being compilations. Starting off with Necronomicon. I feel like I kind of have to mention this one, even though I originally intended not to. I'll keep it short. With Jeffrey Combs playing H.P. Lovecraft himself, the wraparound features him sneaking into a guarded section of the library to read from the Necronomicon, the apparent source of his stories in this universe, as we see 3 of those stories adapted in anthological format: The Rats in the Walls, Cool Air, and The Whisper in the Darkness. Each of them misunderstanding and butchering the source material in varying degrees. Hey, I finally get to be that brand of snob, cool. If this had just taken inspiration and made new Lovecraft stories, instead of attempting to adapt them, I think it would have fared much better. Honestly, with how far off they are, they could have just not mentioned that these were supposed to be adaptations of stories, and I think it could have slid by without anyone noticing. But sadly, nothing exists in a vacuum, and when you deliberately set out to adapt a story, it will continue to be viewed and criticized in relation to that source material. And if you miss the importance and nuance of the story, then it begs the question why adapt it in the first place. To be positive for a second, because I don't like being so negative, I kind of enjoyed the story that's said to be a adaptation of Rats in the Walls. It doesn't feel like Rats in the Walls, it feels like a mishmash of a bunch of other Lovecraft stories, but I kind of liked what it was doing up until the finale, because of course I just dislike when they put action in it for no reason. But whatever. Moving along, but thankfully there is a better anthology filled with more direct adaptations that doesn't stray too far from the source material. Dunwich Horror and Other Stories. This is an anthological film with a short runtime of 46 minutes that adapts the stories of The Picture in the House, The Dunwich Horror, and The Festival. While The Dunwich Horror has a few adaptations to choose from, the other 2 being so short they rarely get love outside of short films, so it's nice to have a feature-length package containing these less adapted stories. Filled with tons of well-composed still shots and a great score, the film itself uses a fun style of animation, acting more as claymation dioramas with the occasional human movement, giving it a very distinct atmosphere and vibe that I can't remember having ever seen done explicitly for horror before. If you have anything like it, please send it my way. This lends itself perfectly to the dread of Lovecraft stories. This film also saves the best segment for last, in my opinion. While the Dunwich Horror was very good here, by and far the most amazing is the rendition of The Festival, where towards the end it utilizes its unique format to its fullest potential, putting on an otherworldly trip of Lovecraftian proportions. Now, the reason this section is called Compilations and not just anthologies is because of the final inclusion, The Unnamable, and The Unnamable 2. This is a two-part movie series very loosely based on the short story The Unnamable by Lovecraft, that features Randolph Carter in a cemetery with his friend discussing something that is imperceivable to the natural five senses that humans possess, which of course Lovecraft will then devote a huge chunk of the story to describing the indescribable thing. Then Carter and his colleague are attacked by said unnamable thing. In the film, Randolph Carter tells two of his friends about the tale of a sort of haunted house involving a window retaining the image of a creature. Hearing this, one of Carter's friends decides to stay in the house and prove it, going alone after Carter and the other friend chicken out. That night, he goes missing. Because we need a movie. The next day, Carter and his friend decide to go looking for their missing friend, while a group of college kids are staying at the haunted house as well, because plot. The parts involving Carter here are very enjoyable, while the parts centered around the group of college kids are enjoyable in a Trolls 2 kind of way, held up by the wonderful setting of an abandoned and spooky house, as well as the cool and different creature effects. Featuring a sort of sympathetic antagonist, much like Castle Freak, a whimsical 80s score, a surprisingly healthy amount of comedy, and a wonderful ending tying it all together at the end of the day. Or the beginning. While the first one is a bit of an odd one, I feel like it really hits its stride and understands what it wants to do with the second movie. Taking notes from the statement of Randolph Carter, this time Randy,
why not just call me Horny Giles or Desperate for a Shag Giles?
And his buds are investigating a tunnel system where they find the creature from the first movie. Now, with some extra development, we know more about the situation, and that the owner of the house had put the demon inside of his daughter after summoning it, and it now wants to destroy the world, because of course. Never want to open up a donut shop or anything else, just world domination. Got it. The creature, now ejected from her body, appears in its own form and attacks the group while attempting to get back in the daughter's body before it's too late. A tale as old as time. This one is a bit more long-winded, but much more polished in my opinion, and with a lot more charm. John Rhys Davies and David Warner make appearances here, and a lot of wink-wink nudge-nudge towards other Lovecraft stories, working to develop the world building within this short-lived franchise. The idea of a TV show detective series following good old Randy as he goes about Arkham and all of the Lovecraft locations, solving various mysteries and crimes pertaining to different Cthulhu mythos stories, is such an interesting concept that it absolutely sucks that we didn't at least get 2 or 3 more movies like this. Like, come on, man, we can get Fast and Furious 14 where Vin Diesel learns how to drift a helicopter on the ocean floor, but oh no, Unnamable 3, that just doesn't appeal to our shareholders. Fuck off. Immediately after finishing this movie, I went back and rewatched the first one. I actually wrote in my notes, Wishbone for Lovecraft, which kind of gets the whole vibe of these films across. They're good fun with a heavy focus on practical effects featuring common characters and locations from Lovecraft stories. It sucks we didn't get more of them, as I'd love to see a bunch more adaptations in the same vein and from a similar perspective. But there's one last area that I'd like to cover before we finish up this half of the video. And I also want to say thank you for watching. Now, moving on. Normally I don't discuss short films as it makes categorization, collection, and cataloging a bitch of a nightmare. But given Howard Phillips Lovecraft's proclivity towards writing short stories, it would be a huge disservice to not talk about the short films both adapting and inspired by his works. Disclaimer, thanks to the aforementioned bitch of a nightmare, this is not a definitive list. I've come to find out that trying to be definitive with short films is practically impossible. It's just a list of some of the ones that I saw that I thought were either great or just interesting. So, let's cover some adaptations and inspirations in the world of short films. Starting off with adaptations. Our first film is A Lovecraft Dream by Michel Botticelli, filled with tons of Lovecraft mainstays as we take a look inside the dreams of H.P. Lovecraft. This short film is very beautifully stylized, using a cut-out style approach to the animation with a lovely sketch aesthetic that I obviously adore. Warning, the lights are a bit flashy. You'll be hearing that a lot. Next up is an adaptation of From Beyond by Michael Granberry. Remember how I said that stop motion is a great way to depict the horrors of Lovecraft? Well, here's a stop motion version of From Beyond that puts that to the test. Taking place in what looks like Courage's attic, a man sits down at a TV and follows the instructions left for him by his scientist friends, as our eyes open up to strange dimensions. A very fun adaptation of the story. Yet another warning for flashing lights. I feel that short films are way more abrasive with their use of flashes, so that's why I'm putting these here, as a heads up for my fellow people with photosensitive epilepsy. We also have another animated adaptation with Blue Worm's Dagon. So while doing the research into short films, this name kept popping up a lot. As far as the Lovecraft adaptations go, they're pretty hit or miss on the whole, but I think the best of them is Dagon, where we get not only a wonderful Harryhausen-style stop-motion animation that Blue Worm specializes in, but also set design like a Méliès film. Told mostly through live action, this serves as a faithful adaptation of the story that started it all. Blue Worm is still making YouTube videos, by the way, even as recently as a week ago while writing this part of the script. So go check him out. Have you ever wondered what a Lovecraft story would look like if it were made on a PS2? No? Well, someone did. The Shadow over Innsmouth was here rather faithfully adapted by New Art Pictures. Almost like watching a Let's Play of a point-and-click adventure game, this adaptation gets a mention for its charm. There are odd choices for where to cut corners, some I'm happy with and some I'm missing from the story, but overall, an easy recommend for its sheer uniqueness. It'd be cool to see more PS2 short films, honestly. I know Code Orange has made some music videos with that aesthetic, and I just dig it, probably because of the nostalgia though. Next up is The Statement by Owen Imgrund. I hope I'm saying that right. A man, after being arrested for loitering in a graveyard, is being interrogated about the events that occurred earlier that night. This is an adaptation of The Statement of Randolph Carter that takes some interesting liberties with the story, making for a fun bookend and a pretty dope short film that makes the most out of its budget and is definitely getting their money's worth out of that fog machine. The Statement of Randolph Carter is actually a super easy to adapt story, so much so that all you really need is one actor and access to any sort of hole in the ground. Perfectly exemplified by the short film 13th of March 1941 by Robert P. Olson. Although I personally think the story here, delivery, editing, yada yada, could have used a bit more polish, it is still a good example of low-budget filmmaking. A single actor, a single room, just the entrance of a well, and access to some old-timey clothes and gear, and bam, you have a short film with an engaging story. For our final pick for adaptations, we have Backwoods by Ryan McFall. An adaptation of The Picture in the House, this short film is filled with wonderful compositions and creative choices that makes for an engaging and mysterious atmosphere leading up to the climactic reveal that was, out of all the adaptations I've seen in short film form, portrayed the best here. Moving along, sort of falling in line with adaptations are the comedy skits of Chris Lackey and Greg Johnson, From Beyond the Beyond, The Ordeal of Randolph Carter, and Pickman's Guest. Short, sweet, and to the point, with some great set design and props, and of course, jokes abound.
You don't sound like you.
I have a cold.
These are great to put on for a quick dose of cosmic horror, light on the horror. Another collection of comedy shorts are the fake commercials made by Joseph Nani, that reimagine the Cthulhu mythos in a materialistic world where you need insurance from cosmic entities, or can buy a limited edition version of the Necronomicon, but only if you call in the next 5 minutes. Straight-faced and full of in-jokes, these short films are a real treat made by clear fans of Lovecraft.
And remember,
just because it has tentacles doesn't mean it's Lovecraftian.
No, I think this qualifies.
The last collection of shorts that I will be featuring are the short films of Patrick Muller, including The Color Out of Space and one based on Lovecraft's poem The Garden. These are less narrative and more experimental, taking excerpts from the stories of Lovecraft and intercutting that with very moody shots, heavily stylized with its film print and grade, with an underlying astral score. Again, no story here by traditional terms, but these are very nice. Artsy-fartsy, but in the best way possible. I really enjoyed them. Now, finally going towards Lovecraftian shorts, more inspired by his writing rather than adapting, we have Between the Stars, directed by Ji Hong Tung. An overworked man returns home, where he lays outside his apartment window to gaze at the stars above him, as he starts to see the stars everywhere in his day-to-day life. I couldn't find subtitles for it, but the general gist of the film is universal. Great sound design and good cinematography. I enjoyed the camera work most of all with its subtle Raimi-isms, and combined with its punchy black and white image, it's hard not to draw comparisons between it and the surrealist work of Lynch. Really enjoyed this one. Carcosa by Ignacy Roque. Flashing lights warning. Like holy shit, flashing lights warning. I'll be avoiding those scenes for this portion, so no worries there. But if you are even a little bit photosensitive, do not watch this short. Shout out to the director for actually including a flashing lights warning as well. While walking through the woods, a man stumbles upon a cult of hooded figures and a strange well that leads him to a bizarre world. Inspired by both Call of Cthulhu from Lovecraft and fellow weird fiction and mythos contributor Ambrose Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa, this short film is very stylized, lacking any dialogue and filled with cultist, mystery, dread, and a ton of nice shots of trees that divulges into a trippy audiovisual experience that is just simply amazing, so long as you don't have photosensitive epilepsy. Dark Noir is an animated short film by Raphael Grampa, working together with a team of animators called Red Knuckles. Accurate? A detective is called upon by a man who once had a muse for his artwork, fueling his creativity, until one day she disappeared, and he wants the detective to find her. As the story progresses, the trail leads the detective to finding out more about himself than he wanted to. This short is getting a mention here because despite its breakneck pace, speeding through plot points before anything really has time to settle in, I think the story here is very intriguing, and I wish it could get at least a much longer version greenlit, if not a feature-length version, as it would probably fare really well with the more gothic-leaning fans of Lovecraft, myself included. Dirt Dauber by Steve Daniels. Quick warning, the opening of this film shows what appears to be actual fish mutilation, so you can skip this one if you want. After a man wakes up unclothed and unaware in the woods near a reservoir, he hitches a ride from a local. They have an interesting conversation that leads to discussion of folklore, a cave, and a certain insect, as they decide to go check the cave out, searching for answers. This has all the low-budget goodness you could ask for. Overexposed black and white, wild editing, as well as a pointlessly crude conversation that could really only exist in an independent film. It even has some cool handmade animation when discussing the cult and the cave. I love the switch to color halfway through, and of course the reveal at the end. A very Lovecraftian film in spirit and in tone. Echoes in the Ice by B.J. Verreau. A group of men head to an abandoned research facility in the Antarctic in order to scrap it. When they discover a well with a strange liquid inside of it, they begin to wonder just what was being researched here. Man, is this in Antarctica? Alaska? Norway? I suck at geology. I really dig this setting, because of course I do. Snowy wasteland and an abandoned, seemingly 80s era research base. Fuck yes. It really feels like a great introduction to a feature film, and that the story is just getting started. Despite leaving you wanting more from it, it's still a great short that doesn't overstay its welcome or overcomplicate things, bringing with it the dreadful atmosphere of a good old-fashioned Lovecraft story. Harbinger by Gearmark TV. A man looking for someone who can help with his recurring visions finds himself in a dingy cabin, unraveling the truth as the unhinged owner abruptly returns home. Shot from a POV of the main character as things go from worse to worser, this feels like Hardcore Henry meets Resident Evil, featuring some Cthulhuisms. Late Bloomer by Craig McNeil and Clay McLeod. This lovely little comedy short posits the question, how would Howard Phillips Lovecraft respond to an in-depth sexual education class? And honestly, I think it nails it on the head. Phrasing. Filled with all the extensive description and unspeakable horrors of Lovecraft's fiction, the absolute over-the-top voiceover narration does a good job of reeling it all in and making this a slightly overly long but enjoyable watch. Leviathan by Eric Woolcott. A man inherits his father's case files from his last investigation, and as he goes through them, he starts to become obsessed with putting all the pieces together. It's pretty obvious that it's an adaptation of Call of Cthulhu, but it reworks the story into a modern retelling focusing on a man coming to terms with the loss of his father. This short film is heartfelt, well-paced with minimal dialogue, and while going in a direction any Lovecraft fan would expect it to, it still maintains its own vision apart from the mythos. This was an absolute treat to find. Portrait of God by Dylan Clark. While prepping for a presentation on a painting said to be a portrait of God that only some can actually see, a woman is troubled by the fact that she can't see it until something out of the absence starts to peer back. This is a very modern horror short that remixes psychological horror with Lovecraftian themes of insignificance and an otherworldly being that only some can see. Very much inspired by the work of David F. Sandberg, it tends to thankfully shy away from bombastic jump scares instead aiming to unnerve the audience. Featuring very claustrophobic cinematography, making it difficult to orient ourselves, this is a very effective little horror short that acutely dials in the creepy and unsettling tones commonplace within Lovecraft's writings. Sound from the Deep by Antti Lakari and Jonas Alonen. I am butchering names today. Let's go. A group of scientists in search of resources in Antarctica are almost done with their trip when they pick up on an anomalous sound that leads them deeper into uncharted territory as they try to find its source. Feeling like a mixture of Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness, this short is one of the more popular Lovecraftian shorts, and for good reason. Featuring voiceover narration retelling the events of what happened to the crew, mysterious mysteries, startling discoveries, increasing madness on top of the isolation, roll that all up, and this film really shows an understanding of what makes a Lovecraftian story actually Lovecraftian. Some pretty nitpicky issues with more so the grading choices and inclusion of some cliched bits, but it does have serviceable acting, some good shot composition, and of course, bolstering it all up is a very intriguing story at the core that keeps you invested. This is a neat portmanteau of Lovecraft's works that brings us something unique yet familiar. The Worm by Andy Coyle. After a normal girl who was involved with what officials claim to be a shared psychosis suffers a mental break, she is sent to a facility where her therapist attempts to uncover what really happened, before she is sent to a more isolated ward. I love when Lovecraftian stories decide to go with a thought virus portrayal, so this was a cool short. With some kinks here and there, as well as being a bit long-winded with the narration, it still has that cartoon animation style that is very amusing to see done for horror, and especially in a slow-burn psychological horror like this one. White Walls by David James Armsby. A man, once confined to a room, gets to peer out beyond it for a glimpse, seeing a world beyond comprehension. It really uses its well-polished animation to its strengths, with a damn good theme touching on H.P. Lovecraft's agoraphobia and how he viewed the world as horrific and scary, twisting and turning that for his stories and creations. This short film, in turn, uses that for a story about human limitations and understanding, and how pulling back the curtain can shatter our understanding of life. This is a short one, but it was one of my favorites. Another short film is AM 1200, directed by David Pryor. A man on the run after framing his colleague finds himself drifting along an aimless highway when he picks up a distress signal from a nearby radio station. Deciding to help, he drives there, where he finds that the station is abandoned, at least on the surface. Oh hey, it's Leland Palmer. Featuring some stellar sound design and proper gravity afforded to the major moments of the film, this was one of the better short films in general, as well as having some really cool cinematography and mood. This short film from David Pryor shows a lot of promise. Well, that about does it for this half of the discussion. I really hope you enjoyed going over Lovecraft's work and the direct film adaptations of them with me, and maybe you even found a new film to watch. I learned a lot of new things with this video, even if it did take me forever to finalize a script. Going through and reading even a small portion of Lovecraft's library was a very fun experience that I'm glad I took the time to do. It helped me gain even more appreciation for a genre that I already loved. And while going through adaptations, most of which were new watches for me, which is kind of rare, it was fun to go back through time and see all the different eras of filmmaking and their interpretations of Lovecraft's story. From the campy fun splatterfest to the more nuanced and thoughtful renditions, films that aim for translational accuracy and ones that just use the major plot points of Lovecraft's work as a stepping stone to tell a new story. Even if the majority of adaptations have their varied faults, there's tons of charm and lots of things for many different filmgoers to enjoy. Stay tuned for Part 2's release, where we will take a deeper dive into the vast and ever-growing universe of cosmic and Lovecraftian horror in film. I've been Hound. Later.